There's a place at the very edge of Cedar Valley where the air smells faintly of gunpowder and pine, where the sound of rifles echoes off the hills and fades into a silence so deep you can almost hear the wind thinking. Most who come here are just passing time, chasing bullseyes, or bragging rights. But one quiet morning, a man stepped onto that range who carried more than a rifle. He carried a history so heavy it could bend the air around him. He didn't come for trophies. He didn't come for applause, and he sure didn't come to prove anything. Yet, with one shot, he would silence the laughter, stop the talking, and turn an ordinary Saturday into the beginning of a story no one at Cedar Valley would ever forget. Because sometimes the most dangerous men don't raise their voice. They don't raise their fist, they just raise a rifle. And change everything. Before we begin, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. The air at the Cedar Valley Shooting Range was sharp with the smell of gunpowder, drifting across the gravel lot as the pop of rifles and the crack of pistols echoed off the hills in the distance. People came here for different reasons, some to practice for hunting season, others to keep their skills sharp for competitions. But that Saturday morning, all eyes would find their way to the last stall on the far end of the range. It was the stall no one really paid attention to. A weathered wooden bench under a faded green canopy, and on it sat a man who looked like he had stepped out of another time, his back straight despite the years etched into his frame, his hands resting lightly on his knees, and in front of him, a rifle that looked almost as old as he was. Most people at Cedar Valley came in pickup trucks or shiny SUVs. But he had walked in from the road, wearing a wool coat despite the spring sun and a flat cap pulled low over silver hair. His boots were scuffed, the soles worn smooth, and his movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who measured every moment. The regulars noticed him right away. You couldn't miss how out of place he seemed. There was Tyler, a wiry man in his 40s, who never stopped talking about his match scores. There was Grace, a retired police officer who could hit a bottle cap from 50 yards. And there was Blake, the range's self-appointed king, a big man with a bigger voice, always eager to show off for the crowd. He leaned over to his buddies as the old man set his rifle on the bench. Bet he's here to relive the glory days, Blake said with a smirk. Probably hasn't fired a shot since Eisenhower was president. His friends laughed, the sound carrying just far enough for the old man to hear. But the man didn't look up, didn't flinch. He simply took a soft cloth from his coat pocket and began wiping the rifle down, slow, careful strokes, like it was something precious. Grace watched him a little longer than the rest. There was something in the way he handled that rifle. Not showy, not casual, but respectful. She had seen it before, in veterans who treated their weapons not as tools, but as companions that had carried them through things no one could talk about easily. She wanted to ask him his name, but something told her to wait, to let him speak first. When he finally stood, there was a stillness about him that seemed to hush the air around him. The range was noisy, people chatting between shots, brass clinking on the concrete, but as he stepped to the firing line, his presence seemed to draw the sound away. He set his feet, brought the rifle to his shoulder, and took a slow breath. Blake called out from 2 stalls over, "Hey, old-timer, hope you remembered how to aim." More laughter, but it was fading. The old man didn't answer. He looked down the scope, finger resting on the trigger guard, not yet ready to fire. He was measuring, calculating, his eyes narrowing just slightly, his breathing steady. The target downrange was a standard paper bullseye at 300 yards. But the wind that morning was fickle, gusts dancing across the valley in unpredictable swirls. Even the best shots had been off by inches. Blake had been bragging about how close he'd gotten to center, and Tyler had sworn the wind was impossible to read. The old man's finger found the trigger, and for a heartbeat, the entire range seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted again, a subtle whistle through the grass. And then the shot rang out, one single crack that echoed like a question across the hills. A puff of dust rose just behind. The target stand, not from the paper, but from the small metal disc Blake had hung behind it for fun. No one had hit it all morning. It was the size of a silver dollar and swayed lightly in the wind. Now it swung wildly, struck dead center. The laughter stopped. The chatter went quiet. People looked from the target to the old man, then back again. He lowered the rifle slowly, his expression unchanged, as if he'd done nothing at all. Grace took a step toward him, a question already forming in her mind. But he simply set the rifle on the bench, picked up the cloth, and began wiping it again, like the shot had been just another part of his morning. Nothing worth talking about, nothing worth remembering, though everyone else knew they would remember it for a very long time. For a few moments, no one moved. The echo of that single shot still seemed to hang in the air. Blake shifted uncomfortably, trying to force a laugh, but it came out thin, like he was trying to convince himself the hit had been luck. Tyler leaned forward, squinting through his spotting scope to confirm what everyone already knew. Dead center, he muttered, almost to himself. That's not even possible in this wind. The old man didn't seem to hear any of it. He slid the rifle's bolt open with the ease of someone who'd done it more times than he could count. The empty brass shell rolled gently into his palm, and he placed it in his coat pocket, like it mattered to him in some quiet way. He sat back down on the bench, his hands resting on the rifle, waiting, not for applause, not for questions, just waiting. Grace finally stepped closer, her voice calm but carrying. "That was one hell of a shot, sir. Mind if I ask your name?" He looked up at her, his eyes a shade of gray that seemed to have seen too much. "Name's Walter," he said softly. Walter Hayes. The name seemed familiar to her, but she couldn't quite place it. "Not yet? Do you compete?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Not anymore," Walter replied, his gaze drifting back toward the target downrange. "Just thought I'd see if I still could." Blake, still feeling the sting of his pride, swaggered closer. "Nice trick, old man, but anyone can get lucky once." He gestured to the farthest target stand, a steel plate at 500 yards that no one had touched that day. "Care to try your luck again?" Walter's eyes moved to the plate. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," he said, standing slowly. "But sure." The wind had picked up now, flags along the range snapping unpredictably. Grace frowned. She knew how hard a shot like that would be. Even on a calm day, Walter took his position again, adjusting the rifle's scope with delicate precision, his movements unhurried. Like he had all the time in the world around them, people began to gather, word spreading quickly across the line. Even a few in the clubhouse stepped outside to watch. The chatter dropped to whispers. There was something in the air now, a strange mix of doubt and anticipation. Walter steadied his breathing, eyes locked through the scope. Blake crossed his arms, muttering under his breath about old-timers and their stories, but he wasn't smiling anymore. Walter's finger eased onto the trigger. The valley seemed to hush once again. Then came the crack, sharp and clean, the recoil pushing gently into his shoulder. A heartbeat later, the sound came back, the ringing of steel echoing across the hills. The plate swayed wildly, struck near its center. Tyler let out a low whistle. "That's 2 for 2, he said, almost reverently. The old man didn't gloat, didn't look around for reaction. He simply ejected the casing, placed it in his coat pocket beside the other, and sat back down, his eyes distant, like the shots were just echoes of something far older. Grace studied him closely, something clicking in the back of her mind. She'd heard that name before, years ago, in a story about a marksman who had done the impossible in a place far from here. But before she could speak, a low rumble of engines pulled everyone's attention. Toward the road leading up to the range, 2 black SUVs were rolling in, slow but deliberate, their windows tinted, the kind of vehicles that didn't belong in small towns unless they were here for something serious. The range owner, Frank, stepped out from the clubhouse, frowning. What in the world? He murmured as SUVs stopped, doors opening in unison, and out stepped 3 men in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement or military. They scanned the crowd briefly. Then one of them's eyes landed on Walter. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just kept polishing the rifle. But Grace saw something shift in his expression, the faintest tightening at the jaw, the kind that came from knowing the past had finally caught up. The 3 men walked with a pace that told everyone they weren't here for idle conversation. Their boots crunched over gravel in perfect rhythm. The man in front was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair gone silver at the edges. His eyes were the cold kind that had seen more than they'd ever say. He stopped in front of Walter, his voice firm but respectful. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "it's been a long time." Walter looked up slowly, setting the cloth aside. "Not long enough," he replied, his tone flat, not hostile, but without welcome. The tension between them was immediate. The way you can feel the air shift before a storm breaks. Blake, always eager for drama, leaned toward Tyler and whispered, "What's this? Some kind of old war buddy reunion?" Tyler didn't answer, his eyes locked on Walter, trying to read the man who had just stepped into a story none of them knew they were part of. The tall man's name, they would later learn, was Colonel Mitchell, retired Special Forces, but the mod uniform had never really left him. "We've got a situation," Mitchell said quietly, glancing at the other 2 men who flanked him. "One that needs someone with your particular skill set." Walter didn't look impressed. "I hung that up a long time ago," he said, his hands folding neatly in his lap. "Find someone else." Mitchell shook his head. "We don't have anyone else. Not for this." He hesitated. And in that pause, Grace caught a flicker of something in his eyes, not fear. "Exactly, but urgency. It's a hostage situation. Outskirts of Millerton. The suspect is heavily armed, erratic, and he's set up in the kind of position you can't just storm without losing people." Grace's gut tightened. She'd been in enough standoffs to know what that meant. She stepped forward. "What's your angle here?" she asked Mitchell. "Why him?" Mitchell looked at her, then back to Walter. "Because once, in Kandahar, this man made a shot from a position that no one in our unit thought possible. A shot that saved 6 men pinned down under enemy fire, and he did it in a crosswind twice. As bad as this." The murmurs around the range swelled. Blake's smugness faded into something else, curiosity mixed with unease. Tyler just stared at Walter, like he was trying to imagine what kind of life left a story like that buried under. An old wool coat. Walter's voice was quiet but unyielding. "That was a lifetime ago, Colonel. I'm not your man anymore." Mitchell crouched slightly, lowering his tone so only those closest could hear. "Walter, the hostage-taker is a man named Eric Danner, ex-military sniper gone rogue. He's got a boy in there, 9 years old. Says he won't let him go unless his demands are met. We can't get close without losing people. And no one else can make that shot." The silence was heavy now, every ear straining. Grace's eyes moved between them, her mind already racing. She'd been in the force long enough to know what Mitchell wasn't saying. Time was running out. And if Walter refused, the ending would not be clean. Walter's gaze dropped to the rifle on the bench, his fingers brushing the worn wood of the stock. He closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing a burden he'd hoped never to lift again. When he opened them, there was a steel there that hadn't been moments ago. "Where?" he asked. Mitchell straightened. 5 miles east. Abandoned grain mill on the ridge. He's fortified in the upper silo." He paused. "You'll have 1 shot, maybe 2, before he knows where it's coming from." Walter stood slowly, picking up the rifle and slinging it over his shoulder. "Then what we'll have to do," he said, his voice calm, but underneath it, Grace caught something else, a quiet resignation, Like a man stepping into the past he thought he'd left behind forever. Drive to Millerton felt longer than it was. The black SUV's engine humming steadily as the gravel roads gave way to narrow asphalt. Walter sat in the back beside Grace, the rifle across his knees, his hands resting lightly on it as though it were an old friend he'd never wanted to. See again. Mitchell sat in the front, speaking into a radio in clipped bursts. The other two men, scanning the roadside for threats that probably weren't there yet, Grace, kept stealing glances at Walter. There was a stillness to him, the kind that came from someone who had seen the worst of humanity and learned to carry it quietly. She wanted to ask him why he had walked away from whatever life Mitchell belonged to, but she knew now wasn't the time. When they reached the ridge above the grain mill, the SUV rolled to a stop behind a thicket of scrub pine. The wind here was sharp and unpredictable, carrying the faint smell of rust from the old silos below. The place was a skeleton of its former self-corrugated metal siding peeling away, windows shattered, rusted conveyor arms jutting into the sky like the bones of some forgotten creature. Through the binoculars, Grace saw him, Eric Dannertal, lean, wearing desert fatigues that had seen better days, his rifle balanced on the lip of the upper silo's window, scanning the fields below. The boy was visible only briefly, a small, pale face peeking from behind a stack of crates, the kind of glance that said he didn't dare hope anyone was coming for him. Walter studied the scene through his scope without rushing, his breathing even, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the wind through the movement of weeds far below. Mitchell crouched beside him, speaking low. He's smart. He's using the silos as a natural windbreak, but that also means he's got a narrow field of view. You hit him before he shifts. The boy's safe. Grace kept her eyes on Walter's face, not his rifle. She saw the subtle change there, a moment when his expression went from calculation to decision. You don't get to think about the boy right now, Walter said quietly, almost to himself. You think about the shot. Blake's voice would have been loud here, Tyler's too, but they weren't here. It was just the wind, the low murmur of Mitchell's men checking positions, and Walter's slow, deliberate movements. He adjusted the scope twice, dialed the windage 3 clicks to the left, then settled into the kind of stillness that made him seem carved from stone. The shot would be at nearly 600 yards, through a narrow opening, in shifting wind, on a moving target. Any hesitation and it would be gone. Walter exhaled slowly, his finger resting on the trigger, and for the briefest moment, everything seemed to still: the weeds, the air, even the faint hum of insects in the grass. Then a sudden movement in the scope. Danner stepping forward, turning his head toward the boy. Walter squeezed. The rifle cracked, and the echo rolled out over the valley like a slow drumbeat through the scope. Grace saw the red mist bloom and vanish in the same instant, Danner collapsing sideways without a sound. The boy flinched, startled, then froze, unsure if it was over. Mitchell was already on the radio, his voice sharp. Go, go, go secure the hostage. Walter didn't watch the chaos that followed, didn't track the men as they swept the building. He simply opened the bolt, caught the casing, and slipped it into his pocket alongside the others. Then he sat back, looking out over the valley, not with pride, not even relief, but with the quiet weight of someone who knew the cost of what he'd just done, even if it was the right thing. The boy's cries were the first sound that broke through the static in Walter's mind. Not loud, but raw, the kind of sound that cut past years and miles and went straight to the part of him he tried to bury. Mitchell's men were already guiding the child out of the mill, their movements brisk but careful, checking every corner, even though they knew the threat was gone. Grace moved forward instinctively, her voice soft as she knelt in front of the boy. You're safe now, she told him, though she knew those words would have to be said many times before he truly believed them. His wide eyes flicked past her to Walter, standing back from the group, the rifle now slung loosely on his shoulder. The boy's gaze lingered on him as though sensing something he couldn't name. Mitchell came up beside Walter, his voice low. "Still the best there is," he said, and there was no boast in it, just a truth acknowledged. Walter didn't answer, didn't look at him. His eyes were on the boy. Get him home, was all. He said they moved the boy into one of the SUVs, wrapping him in a blanket. Grace climbed in with him, offering small reassurances while the vehicle idled. Mitchell's men secured the perimeter, speaking into radios, the scene beginning to dissolve. Into the methodical order of an operation closing down, Walter stayed on the ridge a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the valley, but his mind was far away, the wind tugging at the edges of his coat like a reminder. He had done what was needed, and yet the satisfaction others might have felt wasn't there, only a quiet ache in his chest that told him these moments never left you. Not entirely back at Cedar Valley Shooting Range. The story was already spreading. Blake had heard from someone in town who had seen the SUVs race by. The version he told was half speculation and half embellishment. Tyler wasn't saying much, only shaking his head and muttering, "Figures," as if he had suspected there was more to Walter all along. When Walter finally returned to the range later that afternoon, he didn't come in the SUVs. He walked in, the same way he'd left alone, boots crunching on gravel, coat still buttoned against a wind that had faded. He went straight to the far stall, set the rifle on the bench, and began the slow, careful process of cleaning it. Grace followed him in, standing quietly at his side until he looked up. "You didn't have to come back here," she said, her voice not accusing, just curious. Walter shrugged. "Didn't have anywhere else to be," he said, then paused. "And besides, the wind's calmer now." She smiled faintly, recognizing the deflection. "You know they'll keep asking you to do things like this, Mitchell, especially." Walter's hands kept moving, the cloth gliding over the barrel. "I know," he said. "That's why I'll probably leave again." But there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not just weariness, but a faint pull toward connection, toward staying, even if it hurt. Grace didn't press him. She simply sat. On the bench beside him, the sound of brass being placed neatly in a box between them. The air heavy with things neither of them was ready to say, and somewhere downrange, a new target had been set up, the center marked by a small metal disc, swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Waiting *. Walter didn't stand right away. He just kept polishing the rifle in slow, deliberate motions, the kind of rhythm that settled the nerves and cleared the mind. Grace watched him work, realizing that for him, this wasn't just habit. It was ritual, a way of keeping the ghosts in check. When he finally rose, it wasn't with the air of a man showing off, but of someone answering a question only he could. Here the small crowd at the range had grown again. Word traveled fast in Cedar Valley, and even faster when it carried mystery. Blake leaned on the fence a little too casually, but his eyes were fixed on Walter. Tyler had moved closer to the firing line. The others hung back, unsure if they were about to see another miracle, or just the quiet routine of an old man shooting at paper. Walter stepped to the line, lifted the rifle, and looked through the scope. The wind was softer now, but still shifting enough to keep most shooters guessing. He adjusted for it without a word, the kind of subtle calculation that came from years of reading invisible things. Grace saw his breathing slow, his body settle into that impossible stillness when the shot came. It was almost anticlimactic, just a clean crack and the faint sound of steel ringing far downrange. The little metal disc spun in place, struck dead. Center again. Blake swore under his breath. Tyler gave a small grin, and for a moment the tension in the air softened into something like respect. But before anyone could speak, a voice called from behind them, sharp and unfamiliar. Walter Hayes. It wasn't Mitchell this time. It was a younger man in plain clothes, lean with close-cropped dark hair, and a badge clipped to his belt. "We need to talk." Walter lowered the rifle slowly, his expression unreadable. "About what?" he asked. The man stepped closer, his voice carrying enough for the whole range to hear. "About a series of shootings 3 counties over. Long-range, precision work. Someone's been making kills from distances most wouldn't even attempt." "And your name came up." A murmur started immediately. Grace's eyes narrowed. "You're saying you think Walter had something to do with that?" The man didn't flinch. "I'm saying I have to ask the question." Walter set the rifle down on the bench, his hands loose at his sides. "I haven't been near Millerton or anywhere else in months," he said calmly. "If you're looking for a ghost, you're in the wrong place." The man studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Maybe so, but if you hear anything, you find me." He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving the range wrapped in a heavy quiet. Grace looked at Walter, searching for any sign that the accusation had rattled him. But he was already packing up the rifle, methodical as ever. "They'll keep coming, won't they?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Yes," he said simply. "And every time they do, it gets harder to decide whether to disappear or stay." She didn't answer, but in her chest, a decision was already forming. If Walter stayed, she would. 2, because there was something about the way the man carried his past that made her believe there was more he could give. Not just to her, but to this place, to the people who didn't even know they needed it. The next morning, the range was quiet when Walter arrived. A thin mist clinging to the valley and softening the edges of the hills. He preferred it this way. No noise, no crowd, just the sound of boots on gravel and the wind whispering through the pines. He set the rifle case on the bench and began unpacking it with the same care a man might give to a fragile heirloom. Grace showed up not long after, coffee in hand, her steps easy but her eyes watchful. "You're here early," she said, setting the cup beside him. Walter gave a faint nod. "Easier to breathe before the noise starts," he replied, then glanced at the coffee. "Thanks." For a while, they just worked side by side in silence, Grace adjusting targets downrange while Walter checked the rifle's scope. There was an unspoken comfort in the routine, a steadiness that didn't need filling with words. But eventually, Grace broke the quiet. "That cop yesterday, he'll be back, you know." Walter didn't look up. "I know." She hesitated, then asked, "And if those shootings aren't you, do you have any idea who they are?" Walter's hands paused just briefly on the rifle, the smallest crack in his calm. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But that's a name I was hoping never to hear again." Grace leaned on the bench. "You can't leave it like that, Walter." He shook his head slowly. "If it's who I think it is, talking about it just paints a target on everyone standing too close." Before she could press him, the sound of tires on gravel reached them, and a dusty pickup rolled into the lot. 2 men climbed out, locals by the look of them, one in a worn flannel shirt, the other younger with an eager energy in his step. They carried cases that clearly held rifles, but their eyes were drawn immediately to Walter. "You the one they've been talking about?" the younger man asked, his tone half awe, half challenge. Walter glanced at Grace, then back at him. "Depends what they've been saying. They said you hit a silver dollar at 300 in the wind," the younger man said. "And that you saved some kid yesterday with a shot from 600. His voice had that hungry edge of someone looking for a legend to either prove or tear down. "Any of that true?" Walter didn't smile, didn't brag. He just said, "I was in the right place at the right time," then turned back to his rifle. The older man with him gave a low whistle. "That's a way of putting it," he said. "Name's Hank. This is my boy, Drew. We're here to see if we can learn a thing or two." Grace caught the faintest flicker in Walter's eyes, the part of him that remembered what it was like to pass something on. He nodded toward the open stalls. "Set up your rifles," he said. "We'll see where you're starting from." Drew grinned, already moving. Hank followed, and for the first time since she'd met him, Grace saw Walter not just as the man with the impossible shot, but as someone who could turn that skill into something bigger, something lasting, if he chose to. Drew's excitement was obvious. He unpacked his rifle like it was Christmas morning, the stock polished, but the scope slightly misaligned. Hank was slower, more careful, his movements showing the experience of a man who had hunted for years, but never trained for precision. Walter watched them both without a word, eyes catching the small details others might miss, the way Drew's grip was too tight, the way Hank leaned just a bit too far forward when he set his rifle down. Grace leaned against the stall post, sipping her coffee, curious to see how Walter would handle teaching. He didn't bark orders or throw out jargon. He simply adjusted Drew's shoulder, shifted Hank's stance, and spoke in a calm, even tone. The rifle's not just about what you see in the scope. It's about what you feel before you pull the trigger. He said, if you fight it, you'll miss. You have to work with it. Breathe with it. Drew listened, his earlier bravado tempered by the quiet authority in Walter's voice. Hank nodded slowly, absorbing the advice without comment. Walter had them fire at 100 yards first, watching through his spotting scope as each shot kicked up dust slightly off center. You're both jerking the trigger, he said. It's not a command, it's a conversation. You ask the rifle to speak for you. By the third round, Drew's grouping had tightened, Hank's too. Walter didn't praise them outright, but Grace noticed the small nod he gave, the kind that meant they were moving in the right direction. She also noticed how others at the range had started drifting closer, drawn in not by a show of skill this time, but by the quiet way Walter turned precision into something almost meditative. Just as Drew was lining up another shot, the sound of another engine cut across the range. Grace turned, her stomach tightening when she saw the same plainclothes officer from the day before step out of his car. He didn't look at Walter at first, just scanned the crowd until his eyes found Grace, then flicked to Walter. We need to talk again, he said. Walter set his spotting scope down, his face unreadable. You didn't find your ghost? The officer shook his head. I found a pattern. Every one of those long-range killings was done with a custom load, a specific type of hand-loaded round, and your name came up with that too. Grace stepped in, her voice sharp. You've got nothing but a rumor and a pattern. That doesn't make a case. The officer's gaze didn't waver. Maybe, but if I'm right, the man doing this isn't just good, he's trained. Like you, he said to Walter. And if you know who it is, you're running out of time to tell me before more people die. The range had gone quiet again. Drew's rifle still resting on the bench, Hank's hand resting on his son's shoulder, the air heavy with the weight of the accusation. Walter looked down at the ground for a long moment, then lifted his gaze to the officer. If it's him, he said finally, then you're not going to catch him in a patrol car. His voice was steady, but Grace could hear the shift. It was the sound of a man who had just decided not to stay on the sidelines. Grace could see it in Walter's eyes. A subtle tightening, like a door opening to a room he had kept locked for years. The officer, whose name they now knew was Detective Ryan Cole, stepped closer, lowering his voice so only those nearest could hear. We've got a name, but no location. Samuel Vance, ring a bell? The way Walter's shoulders shifted was almost imperceptible, but Grace caught it, and so did Hank, who was standing just behind her. Walter didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. He was in my unit, Walter said at last, his voice quiet. Best shot I ever saw. Until he started believing the rules didn't apply to him. Cole's jaw tightened. He's applying those skills now to the wrong kind of work, and the body count's climbing if he's got a grudge. It's not just personal anymore, it's surgical. He's picking people who won't see him coming. Drew, wide-eyed, glanced between them. You mean like a sniper? Walter looked at him, and for a second, the hardness in his expression softened. Not like one. Son, he is one, and he's better than most." He shifted his gaze back to Cole. "And if you think you're going to stop him without understanding how he thinks you'll lose." Cole didn't waste time with pride. "Then tell me, how does he think?" Walter shook his head. "That's not something I can give you over coffee and a handshake. You want to catch him, you'll need someone who can follow his logic step for step, someone who knows the places he'd choose, the angles he'd see." Before anyone else, Grace could tell where this was heading, and she didn't like it. "Walter, you're talking about going after him yourself," she said. "That's not your job anymore." Walter's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "It stopped being about my job the second Vance started killing like this." He turned to Cole. "You find out where he's been setting up, and I'll tell you where he's going next." Hank spoke for the first time since the conversation started, his voice low. "You sure you want to walk back into that?" Walter glanced at him, and for the first time there was no deflection. "No," he said simply, "but it's the only way to stop him." The mist had burned off now, the sun sharpening the lines of the hills, but the air at the range felt heavier than before. Everyone could sense that this wasn't going to end with just talk. The quiet, mysterious old man with the impossible shot had just stepped into something far more dangerous, and there was no guarantee he'd come back out *detective. Cole didn't waste the moment. He pulled a folded map from his jacket pocket, spreading it out across the bench where Walter had been working. The paper was worn, edges frayed, with red circles marking rural locations across 3 counties. "These are his confirmed spots," Cole said, tapping each with a blunt finger. "But every time, he's already gone when we get there." Walter leaned over the map, his eyes scanning the terrain, not just the dots, but the spaces between them. Grace watched him work, seeing the way his gaze shifted, how his mind seemed to strip away everything except elevation, cover, and line of sight. "You're chasing him in a straight line," Walter said at last. "Vance doesn't move like that. He thinks in loops, in patterns only he can see." Drew edged closer, drawn in by the quiet intensity. "What kind of patterns?" Walter's voice didn't change, but the weight of it pulled everyone in. "Vance always works in threes, 3 shots, 3 locations in a cluster, 2 to throw you off, and 1 for the kill he's really after. The first 2 are distractions, a way to move the hunt where he wants it." Cole frowned. "So where's the third in this cluster?" Walter traced a finger along the map, stopping at a stretch of land near a dried-out reservoir. "Here," he said, "high ground, multiple exits, and it's remote enough that you'd never get there in time without knowing it in advance." Grace glanced at the spot. "That's 20 miles from here," Walter nodded. "If he's setting up now, we've got hours at most." Cole's jaw tightened. "Then we move." He looked to Walter. "You coming?" Walter closed the map, sliding it back toward him. "I'll meet you there," he said. "But I'm not riding in a convoy. If Vance sees that, he'll vanish." Cole studied him for a long second, then gave a curt nod. "Fine, but if you're not there in an hour, we go without you." When Cole and his men left, Grace stayed behind, watching Walter load his gear into an old canvas bag. "You've hunted him before, haven't you?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a quiet truth. Walter zipped the bag, his voice steady. "Once, a long time ago, before I knew what he'd become." She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "And if you miss this time?" Walter met her eyes. "Then he keeps killing, and it's on me for walking away again." He stepped around her, his boots crunching on the gravel, leaving her standing in the slow swirl of dust his steps had kicked up, watching him walk toward something. It felt like the closing of a circle. Walter didn't take the main road to the reservoir. He knew Vance well enough to assume he'd be watching the obvious approaches. Instead, he followed an old logging track that wound through the pines, the truck's tires crunching over fallen needles and loose rock, every bend in the path bringing him closer to the ridgeline he'd seen on the map. The wind had picked up, tugging at the treetops and carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the water that still pooled in the reservoirs. Lowest Basin. Walter parked well short of the ridge, shouldered his canvas bag, and began the climb on foot, every step careful, deliberate. The way you move when you know there's someone up ahead who can see you long before you see them. From the crest, he could see it, a stretch of cracked concrete that had once been the reservoir's spillway, now dry and overgrown. The perfect cover for a shooter. His eyes swept the terrain, noting the subtle dips in the ground, the places where a prone figure could vanish into shadow. And there, just past the rusted guardrail, a faint glint of glass in the sun, he dropped to one knee, bringing his binoculars to his eyes. And there he was, Samuel Vance, lying in the grass. Like a man who had been born there, his rifle aimed downslope toward a narrow dirt road where a weathered farm truck was slowly making its way past. Vance's body was perfectly still, his trigger finger loose but ready, and Walter knew that. Once that finger curled, the world would change for someone down there forever. Walter eased the rifle from his bag, every motion slow, controlled, the way he'd taught Drew just the day before, his heart rate steady, his breathing measured, but his mind was already calculating wind, direction, distance, the way heat shimmered faintly above the cracked concrete, warping the air between them. He could take the shot now, but Vance was partially shielded by a patch of scrub. Walter shifted slightly, the stock settling into his shoulder like it belonged there. His scope found Vance's temple, and for a heartbeat, he saw not the man he'd once served beside, but the one who had chosen this path, the one who would keep choosing it if no one stopped him. A flicker of movement in the periphery pulled Walter's attention. The farm truck had stopped. A man stepping out to check something in the back, and that was when Walter understood. Vance wasn't just targeting one man. He was waiting for the passenger door to open, for whoever else was inside to step into his sights. Walter's finger moved to the trigger, every muscle in his body locking into the moment. He could feel the wind shift against his cheek, hear the faint rustle of grass along the ridge, and then Vance moved. A subtle shift in his posture as he adjusted his aim. A passenger door below cracked open, and a small figure stepped out, no more than a teenager, maybe 15, holding a feed bucket in one hand. Walter felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Vance wasn't just taking lives now. He was choosing moments that would shatter entire families. Walter's breath slowed, the world narrowing to the circle of glass in his scope. He knew he couldn't rush it. Not with this wind, not with this distance. His finger eased against the trigger, and in that frozen sliver of time, he remembered Kandahar, the dust, the heat, the way a single decision could change everything, for better or worse. But before he could fire, Vance shifted again, not from hesitation, but because he knew. Walter saw it in the way his head turned slightly, the way the barrel of his rifle angled just off target. For a fraction of a second, Vance had felt him, the same way Walter could feel when eyes were on him in the field. And then, without breaking his aim, Vance's voice came across the ridge, low but clear, carried by the wind. "That you, Hayes?" Walter didn't answer, not yet. He kept his breathing steady, watching for the smallest tell in Vance's movement. But Vance wasn't moving now, just holding, waiting. "I figured you'd show up eventually," Vance continued. "You were always the only one worth worrying about." Grace's voice echoed in Walter's mind. The warning she'd given him before he left, but it was too late for that now. The boy below had moved closer to the truck, still unaware of the crosshairs hovering over his life. Walter knew he had only seconds before Vance made his choice. He called back across the ridge, his tone even. "It doesn't have to be like this, Sam," he said. "Walk away right now, and you get to live with whatever's left of yourself." Vance gave a low, humorless laugh. "You still don't get it, do you?" I'm already gone. This is all that's left. Walter's finger tightened just enough, his mind calculating the way the wind had eased for just this heartbeat. He could feel the shot aligning, not just the mechanics, but the inevitability of it. Two men bound by the same skill, standing on opposite ends of the same path, with only one of them able to walk away. And then, from far down the ridge, the faint crackle of a radio Cole's voice, urgent and breaking through the stillness. "Hayes, we've got movement on the south road. Do you copy?" Walter didn't take his eyes off Vance, but he knew this was it. Whatever happened next would decide whether the boy below ever saw another sunrise asterisk. Walter didn't answer Cole's call, his eyes never leaving the glass of his scope. The teenager below was shifting his weight, starting toward the back of the truck where Vance's shot would be clean. Walter knew there was no more time for talking, no more room for anything except the truth of the trigger. But Vance spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost like they were back in the barracks decades ago. "You remember the ridge outside Kandahar? You thought you saved everyone that day, but you never knew the whole story." The words hung in the air, pulling at Walter's focus, threatening to dig open old scars he'd kept shut. Walter forced his mind back to the present, the crosshairs. Holding steady. "This isn't Kandahar," he said, "and I'm not going to let you write another ending." Vance chuckled, the sound bitter, always the hero. "Hayes," and then, without another word, his rifle barrel dipped a fraction toward the boy below. That was the moment Walter needed. The line between hesitation and certainty vanished, and he squeezed the shot, cracked across the ridge, the recoil firm but familiar against his shoulder. Through the scope he saw Vance jerk back, the round striking high in the chest, not instant, but enough to break his aim. The boy flinched at the noise, dropping the bucket, scrambling back toward the truck. Vance rolled to his side, his rifle slipping from his grasp, but even wounded, his eyes found Walter. And for a fleeting moment, they were just two men staring across a distance that had nothing to do with yards or meters. "Only history. Guess you're still the better shot," Vance rasped, a faint smile curling his lips before his head fell back against the grass. Walter didn't move right away, didn't celebrate. He just kept the rifle steady until he was certain Vance was done. The sound of boots pounding up the ridge reached him. Cole's men moving fast. Cole himself breathing hard as he closed the gap. "Is he?" He started to ask, but Walter cut him off with a small nod. Lowering the rifle at last, Cole exhaled, glancing downslope where the boy was being ushered into a deputy's vehicle. "You saved him," he said, but Walter's eyes stayed on Vance, the weight of the shot settling on him like it always did, heavy and familiar. A reminder that skill could end a threat, but never erase the cost. Grace's voice came over Cole's radio a moment later, asking for confirmation. Cole answered with a simple, "It's over." But Walter knew better. These things were never really over, not for the ones who had to live with what it took to make them end. Asterisk. Cole's men moved quickly, securing Vance's rifle and checking his body for anything that might tell them more. One of them pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket, flipping through pages of scrawled coordinates, names, and numbers. Cole glanced at it and frowned. "This isn't over," he muttered. "These are planned hits." And Vance was just one piece of it. Walter heard the words but didn't react. He was still kneeling beside his rifle, methodically unloading it, sliding each round back into its pouch like the act itself was a way of sealing the moment shut. Cole crouched beside him. "You're not going to ask what's in there?" Walter finally looked at him, his eyes tired but steady. "If I ask, you'll want me to help chase the rest, and I've done my chasing." He stood slowly, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Vance was mine. Now he's done. The rest is yours." They started down the ridge together, Cole's men fanning out behind them. The boy was sitting in the back of the deputy's SUV, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the floor. Grace was there now, crouched beside the open door, speaking. To him in that calm way she had, she looked up as Walter approached, her eyes searching his face. "You all right?" She asked. Walter gave a small nod, though they both knew the truth was more complicated. Grace glanced toward the SUV, where Vance's body was now covered with a tarp. "He was someone you knew well, wasn't he?" Walter's gaze followed hers. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Too well." The convoy moved out slowly, Cole leading the way back toward town, but Walter didn't ride with them. He chose the long walk down the ridge to where his old truck waited. Grace fell into step beside him without asking. The crunch of gravel under their boots, the only sound for a while. When they reached the truck, Walter set the rifle case in the bed, leaning on the tailgate for a moment. "You know, people will talk," Grace said. "Some will say you're a hero. Some will say you're dangerous." Walter gave a faint, humorless smile. "They can both be right." As they climbed into the truck, Walter glanced once more toward the reservoir, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. For a moment, he thought he saw two figures on opposite ridges, rifles in hand, like ghosts caught in the last light of day. And then the image was gone, leaving only the quiet and the road ahead asterisk. The drive back to Cedar Valley was slow, the road winding through long stretches of pine and open fields that seemed too quiet after the tension of the ridge. Grace sat in the passenger seat, one arm resting on the open window, the wind pulling at her hair. Walter kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was still back there, replaying every second of the shot when they reached the outskirts of town. Walter turned down a side road instead of heading straight to the range. Grace glanced at him. "Where are we going?" He didn't answer right away, just kept driving until the gravel gave way to dirt, and a small weathered cabin came into view, tucked between two old oaks. "Home," he said simply. The place looked untouched by time, the porch sagging slightly. A rocking chair in one corner, the paint on the door faded to a pale gray. Walter parked the truck and stepped out, the creak of the porch boards greeting him like an old friend. Grace followed, her eyes scanning the place. "You live here alone?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Walter unlocked the door and pushed it open. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and gun oil. A small wood stove in one corner, a worn armchair by the window, shelves lined with books and old photographs. Grace's eyes caught a picture of Walter, in uniform, younger, standing shoulder to shoulder with another man who could only be Vance, both smiling like they'd never see the day they'd end up on opposite sides. She didn't comment, but Walter saw her looking. "That was before," he said, his voice low. "Before things got complicated." They settled in the small kitchen, Walter pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. Grace leaned against the counter. "You're not going back to the range tomorrow, are you?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not right away. I think I've been seen enough for a while." But Grace could tell from the way he spoke that the range still meant something to him, the same way teaching Drew and Hank had lit some small ember. He thought was out. She decided not to push it yet. "You know, Drew's been talking about that lesson all night. Hank, too," she said. "You might have started something there." Walter sipped his coffee, the steam curling between them. "Maybe," he said, but there was a flicker in his eyes, the kind that hinted at the possibility of staying connected. Even after everything outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the oaks, carrying with it the quiet reminder that the world out there was still turning, still full of threats and moments where someone had to make the shot, whether they wanted to or not. Asterisk. The next morning came with a pale, cold light filtering through the cabin's single front window. Walter had been awake for hours, sitting in the armchair with his coffee gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, the events of the past 2 days looping in his head like an old reel. Grace had stayed in town overnight, but promised she'd stop by before heading to the range. And true to her word, her truck crunched up the dirt drive just after sunrise. She stepped inside without knocking, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of fresh bread. "Figured you probably didn't bother with breakfast," she said, setting it on the counter. Walter gave a small nod of thanks, but didn't move from the chair. "You hear from Cole?" he asked. Grace leaned against the counter. "Yeah. He says Vance's notebook has more than just targets. It's got meeting places, drop points, maybe even names. But it's coded. They're bringing in people to crack it." She paused. "He also said the department's been getting calls from people who know you, some good, some not so good." Walter gave a faint, humorless chuckle. "That's the thing about the past. It never stays where you put it." He set the empty mug down. "What about Hank and Drew?" Grace's face softened. "They're at the range right now. Drew's been telling everyone he learned from the best, even tried to mimic your stance." She smiled. "He's not half bad either." For the first time that morning, Walter's expression eased. "Kid's got steady hands," he said. "Could be something if he sticks with it." Before Grace could respond, the sound of tires on gravel reached them again. But this time, it wasn't her truck. It was Cole, stepping out with the same focused urgency as before. A manila envelope in hand. "We got the first page of Vance's notes decrypted," he said without preamble. "And your name's in it." Grace stiffened. "In what context?" Cole laid the envelope on the table, sliding out a photocopy of the page. It was a list of dates and locations, and beside one, in Vance's messy handwriting, were the words Hayes last shot. Walter studied it for a moment, his voice calm, but clipped. "He was planning on finishing what we started either way," he said. "Guess I just got there first." Cole nodded. "Maybe so. But it also means someone else could pick up where he left off." His gaze was steady. "We're asking you to consult, nothing more. Just help us understand the rest of this before it's too late." Grace looked at Walter, reading the hesitation in his posture, the tug of war between walking away and stepping back in. "If you don't do it, someone else will," she said quietly, "and they might not see the angles you do." Walter leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting to the window, to the line of oaks swaying in the breeze, and he knew, deep down, that the road wasn't finished yet, not for him. Walter didn't give Cole an answer right away. He stood and walked to the kitchen counter, taking the bread Grace had brought and slicing it in slow, deliberate strokes, a kind of small, steady task that gave him space to think. Cole waited, arms crossed, eyes flicking between him and Grace. Knowing better than to push too fast finally, Walter set the knife down. "If I say yes, I'm not signing up for patrols or stackouts," he said. "I'll look at your files. I'll tell you what I see, but when I say I'm done, I'm done." Cole nodded without hesitation. "Fair enough." He slid the rest of the papers from the envelope onto the table, photographs, maps, and more pages of Vance's scrawl. Walter sat down and began sorting through them, his hands moving with a kind of muscle memory, stacking and grouping by. Detailed terrain features in one pile, timing patterns in another. Grace moved closer, watching the way his eyes narrowed at certain notes. "You're seeing something," she said. Walter tapped a photo of a grain elevator. "This," he said. Vance never picked his own spots without thinking about how they could be reused. "This location was in 2 other lists I saw years ago. Means he was either planning something here or passing it off to someone else." Cole leaned in. "You think he was part of a network?" Walter didn't look up. "Not a network. A pair. Vance never liked working with more than one person. But if he had a partner, that man would know everything I do. And that makes him just as dangerous." Grace frowned. "Do you know who?" Walter set the photo down slowly. "I've got an idea." His tone made it clear. The name wasn't one he wanted to speak out loud yet. The 3 of them sat in the cabin for another hour, piecing through the fragments, until Walter finally pushed. "The last page aside, you've got 2 weeks, maybe less, before whoever's next makes their move, he said. And they're not going to wait for you to be ready. Cole gathered the papers back into the envelope, his jaw tight. Then, we start now, he said. Heading for the door, Grace lingered. You sure about this? She asked softly. Walter gave the smallest shrug. Not sure, but it's the road in front of me, he said, glancing out the window again. And you walk the road you've got, not the one you want. Grace studied him for a long moment before, nodding, and in her eyes he saw the same thing she saw in his, a quiet understanding that whatever came next, they'd be standing on that ridge together, facing it. The following days blurred into a rhythm Walter hadn't lived in years. Early mornings at the cabin table with maps spread wide, afternoons driving out to places on Vance's list to study the terrain, evenings back at the range where Hank and Drew were waiting, eager to learn. Drew's questions were constant, and Walter answered them without impatience. Even when the answers carried more weight than the boy realized, Grace became a constant presence too, sometimes at the range, sometimes at the cabin, keeping him updated on Cole's progress. The investigation was moving, but the clock was ticking. Faster than anyone liked, each new piece of intel pointed to an incoming strike, though the target was still unclear. On the fourth day, Walter took Hank and Drew to a high ridge just beyond town, a place with a clean view for miles. He had them set up their rifles, the sun warm on their backs, the wind whispering through tall grass. You can't just know how to aim, Walter told them. You have to know when not to pull the trigger. Sometimes the best shot you take is the one you don't. Drew frowned. But if you've got the shot, Walter cut him off gently, then you'd better be certain you understand the cost. Every bullet changes something, and sometimes you don't get to choose what. Grace, who had come along quietly, saw the look in Walter's eyes as he said it, and she knew he wasn't talking to just Drew. He was talking to himself, replaying moments from his own life when the decision to fire had left a mark that time couldn't fade. That night, back at the cabin, Cole arrived with a thin folder, his expression more serious than usual. We got another break, he said, sliding the folder across the table. Inside was a surveillance photo, grainy, taken from a distance, but Walter's hand froze when he saw it. The figure in the image was tall, lean, wearing a dark cap pulled low, the stance unmistakable. Grace noticed the way Walter's grip tightened. You know him, she said quietly. Walter nodded once. Name's Mason, he said, his voice low. Vance's spotter back in the day, and just as lethal with a rifle if he wants to be. Cole leaned forward. You think he's the one taking over Vance's list? Walter didn't hesitate. No, he said. I know he is, and he won't stop until someone makes him. The room went still, the weight of what was coming settling over them. This wasn't just another hunt. This was the last link to a chain. Walter thought he'd broken years ago, and now it was pulling tight again, dragging him forward, whether he wanted it or not. Walter didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting a soft circle of light over the maps, tracing Mason's likely routes over and over, his mind working through every possibility, every piece of terrain Mason might favor. The man had been his spotter for years. He knew how Mason thought, how he saw angles no one else would consider, how he could vanish into the land itself. Grace showed up just after dawn with coffee, taking one look at Walter's face and knowing he hadn't closed his eyes. You've got something, she said, setting the cup in front of him. Walter nodded, slowly tapping a point on the map. Here, he said, an abandoned orchard outside Fairfield. Good elevation, dense cover, and an open field that forces anyone approaching into his line of sight. Cole arrived minutes later, his unmarked sedan kicking up dust on the dirt road. You're sure? He asked without preamble. Walter's voice was steady. If Mason's following Vance's plan, this is where he makes his statement. It's not just a target, it's a message. They drove out together, leaving Hank and Drew behind this time. The orchard came into view under a heavy sky, the air still, the rows of gnarled apple trees standing like silent sentinels. Walter scanned the tree line with binoculars, spotting a faint glint on a distant hill. "He's here," Walter said. "But he's not aiming yet, he's waiting." Cole started to radio his men, but Walter held up a hand. "If you move them in now, he'll see them, and he'll vanish. Just like Vance would." Walter's voice was low, deliberate. "I go alone." "I know how to make him hold," Grace stepped in. "Walter, this isn't just some competition at the range. Mason knows you. He'll expect you." Walter met her eyes. "Exactly," he said. "And that's why he won't fire right away. He'll want to talk first." Cole didn't like it, but he didn't argue. Walter shouldered his rifle and started toward the hill, each step quiet, calculated, his boots pressing into damp earth. As he moved through the last row of trees, the glint ahead shifted, and then Mason's voice carried across the space between them. Calm and clear. "Didn't take you long to find me." Hayes, Walter stopped just inside the open, the weight of their shared history hanging in the still air. "Didn't take you long to start what Vance couldn't finish," he called back. Mason's silhouette shifted slightly, the barrel of his rifle still angled low. "Vance was messy," Mason said. I'm going to make it clean." Walter's hand stayed steady on the rifle, but he could feel the edge in Mason's tone, the way it carried not just skill, but conviction. This was going to end here, one way or another, and they both knew it. Asterisk. The space between them felt heavier than the sky above. The orchard behind Walter was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of grass on the hillside, where Mason lay prone. Their eyes met through the scopes, though neither had yet raised the hair. Rifle to full aim. This was the quiet before a storm only two men could hear. "Mason, you don't have to do this," Walter said, his voice carrying steady across the distance. "You can walk away, disappear, start over." Mason's reply was low but sharp. "You really believe that? After all we've done? After all the shots we took that nobody else would? You walked away, Hayes, and left me with the weight. This is the only road left." Walter's jaw tightened. "No, it's the road you chose." He shifted his feet just enough to line the shot without signaling it. "And it ends here." Mason gave a faint laugh, one without humor. "Then let's see if the legend still has it." In the same instant, both men moved, rifles coming to bear, fingers tightening, but Walter had read the wind, the light, the angle. He had read Mason the way only someone who had fought beside him could. His shot broke the air a fraction before Mason's impact was instant. Mason's rifle discharged into the dirt as his body rolled slightly to the side, the breath leaving him in a slow, rattled exhale. Walter held his scope steady, waiting for any sign of another move, but Mason's eyes were already clouding. His gaze fixed on some point far beyond the orchard. Walter approached slowly, keeping the rifle ready until he was certain it was done. Mason's voice was faint now, almost a whisper. "Guess you were always the better shot." A faint flicker of a smile touched his lips, and then it was gone. Cole and his men moved in fast, securing the hill. Grace came up behind Walter, her eyes scanning him for injuries. Before settling on his face, "You all right?" she asked quietly. Walter looked down at Mason for a long moment. "No," he said, "but it's done." The walk back down through the orchard was slow, the air shifting as the tension bled away. Hank and Drew were waiting near the trucks, worry etched on their faces. Walter met their eyes, and for the first time, he let a small smile break through. "Targets are clear," he said, "and now we get back to the kind of shooting worth doing." In the weeks that followed, the orchard returned to silence, and the range to its steady rhythm. Walter kept teaching Hank and Drew, sometimes Grace, passing along not just skill, but the patience and judgment that came with it. People in Cedar Valley still told stories about the old man with the one perfect shot, but Walter never told them everything for him. The legacy wasn't in the shots that made history, but in the ones that never had to be fired, the ones were teaching someone else to breathe steady. And choose wisely meant the world stayed just a little quieter, a little longer.